It's 100% my favorite two properties in property CSS is align items and justify content and just using the value center and just seeing the magic of it just centering up. It's just amazing.
Okay, I use those all the time, but like it's a constant battle of, I want to vertically center this, and I put the wrong one in, and then I put the right one in, or I put the right one in, and then the wrong one in, and then the right one. It's like a, USB. It's like some quantum state that I have to be in 3 states before it actually works. But all that to say, I can never remember which one does which.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Square. Develop on the platform that sellers trust. Here's what you could do with Square. You could bridge more experiences. You can build online, mobile, and in-person commerce experiences that connect more customers and sellers. You can build custom booking solutions. You can create and track orders. You can accept payments. You can manage and curate inventory. You can organize customers. You can manage employees. You can extend Square gift cards to your app. You can use Afterpay. And all this is powered by the world-class Square APIs and SDKs that enable you to build full-featured business apps for yourself or millions of Square sellers. So much is available as a Square Solutions partner. Learn more and get started at changelog.com/Square. Again, changelog.com/Square.
This is JS Party, your weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. We record live each and every Thursday. Subscribe now at youtube.com/changelog to be notified of when we go live. Thanks to our partners at Fastly for delivering all of our shows super fast to wherever you listen. Check them out at fastly.com. And to fly.io, ship your app servers and database close to your users. No ops required. Learn more at fly.io. Okay, hey, it's party time, y'all.
Hoy hoy, welcome to JS Party. I'm your host this week, Nick Nisi. Hoy hoy again. And I'm joined by Amelia Wattenberger. Amelia, what's up?
Ahoy hoy again.
Yes, welcome. Excited to be on the show with you again. And we have some very exciting guests, and we're going to be talking a little bit about CSS. But first, we're going to be talking a tiny bit about CSS, maybe I should say. But first, let me introduce them. And the first one is Martine Dowden. Martine, how's it going?
Hi, how's it going? It's been good.
Good, good. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a front-end UX UI developer, currently CTO at Andromeda Galactic Solutions, and I basically do front-end UX UI stuff and kind of focusing on accessibility and CSS because are kind of my 2 big areas, I guess.
Awesome. And let me just say that Andromeda Galactic Solutions is like the coolest name for a company ever. And joining you as well is Michael Gearon. Michael, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going good. Yeah, hi everyone. Nice to join you.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a UX designer / front-end developer living in South Wales in the UK. At the moment, kind of interaction designer in the public sector. So kind of working through those complicated challenges of the public sector and all the services involved.
That sounds exciting. We had both of you on today to talk about a book that you've written, and that book is called Tiny CSS Projects, that little bit of CSS that we're going to talk about today. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the book?
It's 12 chapters, and each chapter takes a concept in terms of like UI things that you might see, whether it's a layout or more of a kind of a element that you might see commonly. So think like your profile cards, right? That's a concept we see everywhere. And so for each of those kind of projects, we kind of looked at what are some common CSS patterns that we use and some of the common CSS techniques that we use, and tried to figure out a list of projects that were really common, that are often used on websites, and then those main concepts in CSS, things that we need to know in order to effectively use it, and kind of come up with 12 projects that can be done. And then the user can either read it for learning the CSS techniques and apply them and just follow along and write the code, or they can alter it to their, so it can kind of work as in I'm learning how I would design this thing, or here's a reference on how I would go about getting started on something like that, and kind of a jumping point for it for altering, for their purposes later on a website. So it's been a really fun book to write.
I bet. Yeah. And I've been looking through it. That chapter specifically about the profile, I forgot what it was exactly called, the profile section, profile card. That was very insightful and exciting. And like, I was just picturing myself like the next time I need to do this, like this is such a perfect reference for it, whether I'm just like going through it to learn like the CSS or like just pick out parts of it that is like, oh, how should I properly do like a circular avatar or something like that, and like kind of pick and choose from that. So I really, really liked that. And that like, it's just such a perfect reference for things like that.
So I love the idea of little projects.
Yeah.
Is the audience for your book supposed to be people who are totally new to CSS, or people who are looking more for reference material, who are more intermediate or advanced?
Yeah, so it's aimed at those readers are kind of either new to CSS or may have done it as like a request that they don't normally code in CSS, but they kind of like have to go out their way to kind of cover a gap. So the idea behind it is those lowering the barrier to kind of say like anyone can kind of pick up this book and learn about CSS. So yeah, it's kind of like for the beginners who've just got that interest, may have heard about it, and kind of want to get stuck into a project.
The other thing we did is the chapters kind of build on each other. So like the first chapter is going over the real basics. And then as you move on through the book, the concepts get a little bit more complicated and a little bit more involved, and we'd start tying them together. So it can be for somebody who's never touched CSS, who's been forced to touch CSS against their will, because nobody's ever had to do that, could definitely work their way from the start up. Or if it's somebody that already knows CSS or already knows some, could totally use it as a reference for how would I do that one thing that I can't remember how to do, or that little trick that's obnoxious and I can never remember, right? There's always those little things. So it really just depends on where you are on the spectrum, but it's totally usable for both crowds.
And I feel like those things change so often. Well, not really so often, but like they just improve so much. If I never looked at a reference for anything like this again, I'd still be using an image to do my rounded borders. But like, there's new and better and exciting ways to do these things. And I love like that this calls out how to do those.
I've always thought of CSS as pretty stable. I mean, because it's not like very little gets deprecated and very little goes away. But there was the one thing, and it actually bit us in the middle of the book. The eternal adage for those who've done CSS for a while was, you'll never be able to select a parent based on the child. It was like that was the phrase forever. And then like we're about halfway through writing the thing and has comes down the line. And we're like, now I can actually do that. And I have to so we ended up having to rewrite some sections because of that. Because it's like, oh wait, no, it's gone. I can no longer say that.
Yeah, that's something really nice about writing a book about CSS where I wrote a book about D3 and there's new versions coming out. So, you have to rewrite parts of it every now and then. So whenever a new version comes out, I'm excited, but also super frustrated that they changed anything.
Yep. I do a lot of Angular as well, and I have that same problem. Every workshop, everything is like, and gotta run the updates.
Mm-hmm.
This book kind of doesn't go with too much of the newer CSS properties. So it's kind of well-established CSS properties and values and those sort of things that are probably not going to go away, but kind of maybe people haven't got a complete awareness of that existing. So like chapter 4 kind of looks at the multi-column module, CSS module, and kind of creating like a multi-column layout, which I would say most people don't know about, but exists in CSS.
Oh, it has forever.
Yeah, it's kind of raising the awareness of things that you might not know about CSS.
Yeah, and I feel like everyone's experience varies, right? But mine, like it feels like a significant portion of my career, whether I want it to or not, is always trying to abstract away CSS in some way or another. And I did notice that I didn't see any like CSS and JS pieces in here, which is refreshing.
We did that on purpose. We wanted to focus really. And so the last chapter, we're going to touch on precompilers specifically. I mean, there's, less Sass stylus, but we'll do it in Sass because it still seems to be the more prominent one. Mm-hmm. We'll touch on that. But the idea was to really show the concept in CSS itself, because then whether you're using a precompiler, whether you're doing CSS and JS, whatever, the important bit is understanding the concept. After that, you can abstract it to your own environment, do what you want to do with it. But if you don't understand the core at the base, you're still going to be struggling, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like the building a strong foundation that other people can then go on to build on top of. But
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that like people kind of learn CSS through frameworks and kind of don't learn CSS at what CSS is, but they learn like, oh, add this framework and you can magically add classes and then you've got this web page that's complete and looks fine, but you might not actually understand what's going on behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a conscious decision to kind of not talk about frameworks or how to sort of naming structures too much. It's more about just learning the basics and getting that right. And then when you do want to go out and experiment with the frameworks and those sort of things, you actually know what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. That touches on something that I guess relearned recently when I was talking to some of the more junior members on my team about like Tailwind specifically, right? They're using Tailwind in their projects, and like that's a divisive thing, whether Tailwind is good or not, that I don't want to get into. I like it personally, but they were talking about how like it's actually difficult to know like what to do with Tailwind because it maps so closely to CSS. Like you really do have to know CSS to know like, if I want to center this thing, well, like there's the different CSS ways to do that. And then I just have to look up the translation to a Tailwind class. Whereas like in other projects where we're abstracting a lot of that away and like you just set a prop on, you know, a React component and then it takes care of that internally somehow. But the prop is like more named to like, oh, I want to center this thing. And it's not like, oh, I want to have like a flex with like all of that stuff. And so it just like really reminded me how much a good foundation in CSS is, like how valuable that really is for things like Tailwind, but also just for diving a little bit deeper on everything.
yeah.
When if you're using Tailwinds, I would assume you don't have the crutch of important, just, you know, because that's such a common pattern, right? You can tell the level of a developer who's touched a piece of code and how much they love or hate CSS by just doing an important count. Like those two metrics will give you a nice, what was the level of developer and how much do they hate CSS?
To show you what kind of developer I am, I have definitely used important in Tailwind. It is possible.
Oh, it is? Wow, okay.
Yeah. So one thing that I think a lot of developers never really dive too far into are the different layout mechanisms for CSS. Like I think they learn there's absolute and there's relative, but they don't talk about like flex and grid and like how are these things different and what is inline block versus block. So I'm curious how much space you devoted to that in the book, because I feel like it's this rabbit hole that could, you know, be as large as the container you put it in.
Yeah, definitely. We basically cover most, if not all, of the layout. So we do cover Flexbox. We cover the, like I said, multi-column layout module. We cover grid. And then we also cover float, which, Martine, I'm sure you want to talk about. Float is that we used to use float a lot, and now we use it, you know, Flexbox and grid, but float hasn't gone away. So yeah, I think Martine's probably best place to talk about float because she wrote the chapter all about float.
Yeah, float. I have a soft spot in my heart for float because I spent the years fighting with it. And now that we have other layout capabilities, there's so many things it's really good at, but because we spent so many years fighting with it, using it for things we never intended to, it got a really bad reputation. And I mean, and it is kind of, it has its intricacies, but we spent a considerable amount of time actually talking about those layouts. We also talk about the differences between position, absolute, and relative and how they interact, which is often, I think, one of the bit more complex pieces as well. I think like the first 4 or 5 except for the first one, which goes over how to just do properties and classes and stuff. I think the like 3 or 4 chapters after that are pretty much the core focus is layout.
Yeah, it definitely does take center stage layout in some sort of way. And, you know, we do kind of go through that confusion between when to use Flexbox and when to use grid. And, you know, I don't think that's always clear, the differences between the two, you know, and they can be used interchangeably, but there's clear differences between grid and Flexbox, and it's definitely something we explore.
I kind of feel like those two are the new hammer. Like float used to be the hammer. Now I kind of feel like those two have become the new hammer.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Float is my hammer because I hadn't learned up until earlier this year. I was still supporting IE 11.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know. I'm not sure if they had grid support. I don't think they did, but that's the level of progression I got to, was like there. And now I'm like trying to learn grid on top of that. But right now everything looks like a flex to me and I could just do that. And I feel like the same way right now with like container queries. I see like a lot of excitement around that, but then I look and I'm like, well, I can't use it because Firefox. So I'm going to ignore this for a year or whenever it comes out for then. And then I'll look into it again.
It is funny, like how our growth as developers is stunted by the size of application we work on. Like
Yeah.
I can only be as good as the browsers that I have to support.
When you put it like that.
It's really interesting actually about browser support, and this is something that we had a bit of a talk about, is like how far back do we go with browser support, and we consciously decided not to kind of support Internet Explorer. We thought that that's kind of parked and let's move on, because otherwise this book probably wouldn't develop as much as it could have if we kind of look back at Internet Explorer and kind of made it work for, you know, a browser that we're trying to move away from for the last decade, it feels like.
Well, and Microsoft discontinued IE, like officially, like buried it,
June.
put a tombstone on it.
June 15th.
And I was like, I threw a party, I won't lie, and was like, this means I never have to talk about it ever again. If you're still using it, that's on you. That's my stance on the thing.
You're probably used to it not working.
But for your comment about IE and grid, IE 11 did support grid,
Did it?
but it supported a non-standard implementation.
Okay.
So it was the worst of all worlds because it did support it. Ish.
That really is much worse.
This episode is brought to you by Sentry. Build better software faster, diagnose, fix, and optimize the performance of your code. More than 1 million developers and 68,000 organizations already use Sentry, and that includes us. Here's the easiest way to try Sentry. Head to sentry.io/demo/sandbox. That is a fully functional version of Sentry that you can poke at. And best of all, our listeners get the team plan for free for 3 months. Head to sentry.io and use the code PARTYTIME when you sign up. Again, sentry.io and use the code PARTYTIME.
So in the last section, we mentioned that IE 11 had a non-standard grid implementation, but maybe let's dive deeper and talk about standard grid implementations. Specifically, a chapter that's covered in your book all about laying out with CSS grids. So why don't you tell us about what we can expect to learn in that chapter?
So you can learn about, first of all, what grid tracks are. So how we can structure our grid. So kind of like the first step when using CSS grids is just creating the overall structure. So setting rows, setting columns. Mm-hmm. Then we kind of progress into looking at some kind of CSS grid functions. So looking at the min-max function and also the repeat function. So the repeat function is quite an interesting one because you can kind of say in grid, I want 2, 3, 4, whatever columns or rows this size. So to kind of improve the readability, you kind of got the repeat function, which is quite a nice, interesting feature of grid. Then we kind of explore like how to kind of size your grid. And again, it kind of touches into like something which is fairly new to CSS, which is the fractions unit. The fractions unit is kind of specifically for grid, and the fractions is a way of kind of saying like, oh, this column should have 1/3 of the spacing, and then you can kind of say like the rest of the columns or the rest of it should have 2/3, which is again like an interesting one. And then towards the later parts of the chapter, we kind of look at accessibility and what are the implications when setting up a grid and thinking about the kind of the way you structure your grid. Does it logically make sense if you were going to listen to it on a screen reader and not visually, but actually, you know, does the underlying structure match what's visually shown? So yeah, it's quite a lot going on.
I love the focus on accessibility. I feel like that's something that's really easy to skip over, especially in a book where it's not really visual and you can't show the graphics of it. One thing I'm curious about is, like, how did you choose the examples for these chapters? And also, like, how did you get to a place where you're like, this is the right way to do it? Because I feel like there's so many different ways to do these things in CSS.
So for choosing the actual project, there's a little bit of it's that game of what concepts, you're marrying up, these are common patterns, these are common UI elements that we see, and marrying up, okay, with these common patterns and UI elements, what can I build, right? And what techniques would I use? And then so based on that, you can kind of divvy up into, okay, this would work well for this sort of chapter, this would work well for those sort of chapters. So it's kind of a little bit of the game in terms of figuring out, okay, we already had the concept and had to come up with the project, or we had the project and we're like, okay, what concepts match with this project, right? And then in terms of the right way, we tried to pick for implementations that really showed a clear forward path of how you would utilize this particular property or this particular element, and getting a little bit more complex into the book in terms of, okay, we showed a basic implementation in this chapter, maybe a chapter down the line, we might show one of the bit more intricate implementation of that same concept or whatever. But basically trying to keep for what was going to show clear code. And for any given chapter, would there be a more efficient way of writing it? Sometimes. Are there things that maybe in the real world we would have done slightly differently? Probably. It's just because we're trying to show a concept or we're trying to show a particular technique, right? And so generally speaking, those things are called out when that happens. But at some point, you have to make a decision to be able to show the code, right? So... But CSS is no different than any other language. There's always 7 ways till Sunday to lay something out or to do something. There's very few times where it's like, nope, this is the one and only way to do this, right?
So you're saying you could use Flex here? I'm trying to make a joke.
In the grid chapter, you'd end up with a lot of extra divs and a lot of extra code, but you technically could achieve that layout with the Flex, yes.
Or you could just have like 20 images.
Oh, we could just go back to tables and slice and dice. It'll be fine.
Exactly. The good old days.
Talk about not accessible at all.
I love the graphics. I'm just flipping through this chapter. I think they look great, and I feel like they're really informative. How much time did you all spend on making the graphics to support concepts?
Depends on the graphic.
It depends on the complexity. Like some of them, especially in CSS Grid, I think like one of the first, I was a little bit further down, but when we're talking about grid structure, and it shows quite a few concepts. So it looks at what does a track row look like? What does a track column look like? And then the positive numbers and negative numbers. There's a lot of trying to communicate in one graphic. But it took a lot of fiddling, but we managed to get something where it's working. And I think one of the nice things with writing from Manning is that we got this kind of process of going out to readers and kind of getting their feedback. And we've had that feedback as saying like trying to improve the clarity of the graphics as we're going along. And we're kind of coming back to these chapters and making those tweaks to try and improve them further.
Yeah, that's really great. One of the things that I found really difficult with writing a book is like the code is in one place and then the book is in another place. And then if you want to update the code, like how do you update the book, and like what's a seamless process for that? Did you all have like a sane pipeline for that, or did you also find it a little bit maddening?
We have GitHub, we have the manuscript, I really wish there could be a pull this directly from my GitHub and auto update, but that's not, it's copy paste. And then of course the text editor wants to capitalize the beginning of every single line of code because right?
No.
It's exactly the mayhem you would imagine it is.
Yeah, it's often a Slack message just saying like, oh, can you go and update this code in GitHub? And then I kind of go off and update the code in GitHub. So a lot of communication, a lot of kind of, once it's out there, it looks like we've done a good job, but behind the scenes, chaos.
It does look really good. That was going to be one of the questions that I ask is like how you maintain like the manuscript and the code together. And I guess that's exactly what I was expecting for an answer.
We did get smart and we were working in Google Docs.
Yeah?
So at least we don't have versions of the manuscripts floating. So at least there's that.
Yeah.
Final.
That was going to be my next question is what do you actually use to write? And so Google Docs, that's very interesting and fantastic. Such an easy way to collaborate.
I think especially with the two authors and also the publisher, like it seems like the right way to do it as opposed to the emailing the files back and forth.
And, we're all over the place in terms of geographical. Like Martine's over in America, I'm in the UK. Our editor is kind of in America, but a completely different place. And yeah, I think then we've got another one or two editors in a different place altogether. So it's truly like a global book that's being formed here.
Oh, that's so fun.
So going through this chapter, I see a lot of things that I need to go and like visit back to. I'm looking specifically at what's it called? The
template areas.
Oh, template area, grid template areas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's super interesting to me as someone who doesn't know grid.
I personally prefer that to doing the numbers because I can name my areas and especially I know it's very ASCII art-ish, but you end up with when you're laying it out in the code, you end up with here's what I have on my first row, here's what I have on my second row, and it's all named. So from a understanding where my stuff's going to end up, I find it's visually a lot nicer to comprehend. Now, obviously not all use cases you're going to be able to use that technique, but if possible, that's the one I tend to lean towards and prefer because it's so much easier to process at a glance. This is what my layout is in one place.
So is that going to then with any, like the one that says author, for example, in this, that it kind of has it over to the right in the second row, all the way to the right. And is that saying that any DOM element that you give a grid, I forgot what it's called, a grid area called author, it's just going to put it there. It's always going to exist over there. Is that how that works?
Correct. But if you put that on two of them, they'll both be on top of each other in that area.
Okay. That's fascinating though.
I think what's quite interesting around grid areas as well is that if another person kind of comes along at a later date to manage your CSS, it's a little bit more clearer if you said here's the header. If you said header, you can kind of go, yeah, I kind of know where a header should be on a web page, so I can kind of imagine that layout. When you say footer, it makes sense. You would expect at the bottom, although that could cause complications because you can quickly create a very confusing layout if you said oh yeah, my template area, I'm going to call it footer at the top, and you put the header in there. So it could be potentially quite confusing. But if you're logical, then you can kind of create a layout which makes sense for someone else to kind of come along and go, oh yeah, I kind of see that structure, that layout.
I like this too. This comes up a lot with CSS and JS and Tailwind, where the web doesn't make sense anymore. If you look at the source on a web page, you have all these hashes that make sense to computers, but not necessarily to humans. So I like that theme. Sorry, Martine.
I was just going to say that all boils down to naming. It's the same reason you don't name a class blue, right? Because inevitably, whatever was blue, somebody's going to change the design and it's going to end up some other color. And now you have a class blue that turns something orange or whatever the case might be. But I think not necessarily specific to grid, class naming is just as difficult and just as important as variable naming in JavaScript or whatever other language, right? And focusing on the semantic rather than what it does is really, really helpful when you're writing your own CSS.
And then what's quite interesting with the grid area is you can then combine it with a media query, just kind of say as the layout changes, as your browser width or whatever that media query changes, you can then update the grid template area to say, I want to rearrange that layout to make more sense you can have a different experience on mobile as you would for desktop. But then it kind of comes back to the point around accessibility that if you change the template areas too much, then the way it's being coded could be different to the visual order. So the two can kind of fall out of sync a little bit. But it is interesting how you can use a media query in conjunction with this to kind of create different layouts pretty quickly to kind of suit different devices.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Oh, that is interesting. Do screen readers read in the DOM order or in the grid area?
In the DOM order. And it's true of Flex too, especially when you're dealing with reverse and those sorts of things. Whatever the DOM order is, that's what's going to get read. Or even the easy way if you're not a screen reader user, to kind of see is if you're tabbing through links in a project, right? You want that tab order to be logical from top left, like at least for English speaking, right? Top left to bottom right. And so if your grid now magically has this element that in the HTML order is at the bottom, but you've placed it at the top, your tab order is going to go all sorts of which way inside of your grid. Well, your screen reader is going to read it in the DOM order as well. So there's a misconception that only blind users use screen readers. That's not exactly the case, right? You might be using a screen reader as a support for helping you understand what's on the screen, in which case you're looking at the screen and listening to the screen reader. And so you really want that DOM order and that layout to make sense so you can follow along, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. In terms of accessibility for grids, is there anything beyond layout that you need to be aware of?
That's the big one. I mean, you want to always make sure your reflow works. So if you do like Control-Shift+ and, you're blowing stuff up and shrinking stuff down, you always want to make sure that that works because of magnification on a device. Those are probably your two big things with grid. Or just a matter of testing at that point.
Yeah. What's that?
It's that thing we do in production. What? No? It's not the thing users do in production?
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Fly. Run your full stack apps and your databases close to your users all over the world. No ops required. And I'm here with Brad Gessler, who is helping to build the future Rails cloud at Fly. Brad, what's got you excited about Rails on Fly?
It's no secret that Rails is this really productive framework and application. We've also seen that happen. There's a bajillion different hosts that you can choose from out there that all make it really easy to deploy your Rails applications. We've had these for years.
Right.
There's nothing really magical about that anymore. It's just, this is what we'd expect. We want to type a deploy command, and this thing ends up on a server somewhere. The thing that I think that sets Fly apart from all that is it scales. It has so many scaling stories. It has, again, the table stakes stuff. Ooh, wow, you can add more memory to a machine. All those things you would expect from a hosting provider. Again, Fly, you can scale out. You're going to have customers that live in Singapore, that live in Frankfurt. You need to get servers there, and Fly lets you do that. Again, with just a few commands, you can provision all these servers in these different parts of the world. And then the real magic with one command, you can type in fly deploy and you have all these servers provisioned around the world. They just work. People hit yourcompany.com and they're hitting the Frankfurt server, and the same person in Singapore is typing in your .com and it just works, and they're hitting your servers in Singapore. So this thing scales out beautifully, which is really important, especially if you're starting to run turbo applications or turbo native applications where you need that really low latency. Your application needs to respond to these users in under 100 milliseconds. Otherwise, to them, it's not going to be instant. They're going to be waiting. It's important to be fast, and Fly makes that possible. The reason I joined it is because of this kind of global magic that we're going to be shipping, and that's something that I want to bring to Rails developers all around the world.
That's awesome. Thanks, Brad. So the future Rails cloud is at Fly. Global Magic is on its way. Try it free today at fly.io. Again, fly.io.
So another chapter that we wanted to touch on from your book, Tiny CSS Projects, is the 6th chapter, which is about creating a profile card. So this one does a lot in terms of like the overall CSS that you'll use. And like, I just got really excited. We talked about this in the first section. Like, this is such a cool, like, contained component that has so much in it. And it's something that I have totally written before and will write again, and little pieces of it. And so why don't we dig into it and talk a little bit about what it is and what we're going to learn.
So basically, I mean, whether it's a social media thing, whether it's an account thing, whether it's a manage your personal preferences thing, inevitably, we, like most applications at some point, have some kind of profile. And so this is kind of that stereotypical profile card where we have the picture of the person or an avatar for the person, and then their name, and then what they do. Like, so I think we ended up putting things like what their profession and stuff like that. But depending on the application, it could be anything. That the point isn't necessarily content at that point. It's to show how you would display the information for that person, right? And that very stereotypical avatar info, maybe some links, right?
I like this chapter, to talk about this chapter after we talked about the last one, because it seems like this is the one in which it introduces Flexbox, right?
Yeah, that's the one where we use and abuse Flexbox for absolutely everything, just to kind of show what it can do, what are the things that can be done with it, what are the various properties to use with it, that sort of stuff, yeah. Because the interesting thing with Flexbox is it can you get used for layout purposes, but also like for positioning elements relative to other elements. So things that we used to do, like having to calculate the exact margin of elements to be able to spread out the nav, where you spread out all the pieces across the screen. So you give a fixed width to each of the things, and God forbid you gave them an inline block. And so now you have to account for that 1 pixel weird thing that inline block does when you're doing, spreading it out based on percentages. Like Flexbox does all of that for you now, and it's so much nicer and so much more robust than that little game was. But we kind of show how you would use it to like center something on a page or to center a div. The quintessential how do you center a div?
We've solved it.
It's 100% my favorite two properties in property CSS is align items and justify content, and just using the value center and just seeing the magic of it just centering up. It's just amazing.
Okay, I use those all the time, but like it's a constant battle of, oh, I want to vertically center this, and I put the wrong one in, and then I put the right one in, or I put the right one in, and then the wrong one in, and then the right one. It's like a USB. It's like some quantum state that I have to be in 3 states before it actually works. But all that to say, I can never remember which one does which.
Well, and then if you do flex direction column,
yes,
and you change it from being on the x-axis and the y-axis, right, you're behaving differently on the two. Yeah.
Do you all have a good mnemonic for like one is in the axis of flow and one is in the other axis, but like align items and justify content? None of those words make any sense to me.
So I don't have a mnemonic, but if you go to CSS Tricks, there is a cheat sheet for both Flex and Grid that are absolutely brilliant. I still reference them when I forget. Those would be because it has the visual drawings of what's going on with it. It's a question of you already kind of understand what Grid and Flex do and just need that refresher of what the properties are and how they work. That's a great one to look at.
Yeah, and the other piece of that is align items versus align content, and the same for justify. Like I can never remember which one of those.
One of the other interesting things we cover in chapter 6 is around custom properties. So custom properties, again, fairly new and definitely a hot topic. So custom properties is a way of kind of setting kind of variables in your CSS. So you can kind of say in your body element, here's like my primary color, here's my font. And you can kind of set up all these variables, and then in your CSS, you can kind of reference those variables. What that means is in terms of maintainability, you can kind of make that change once, and then it can have that effect then for the rest of your CSS, which is really powerful. And I think it's just a really super interesting property that we've got now.
I think those, along with like calc and min-max and all of the math, CSS functions, CSS methods, I don't know what they're called, are so powerful. I've used those greatly all the time.
The custom properties are also really powerful for doing themes, because then what you do is you set for your themes, you just write your CSS with your custom properties, and then you just change the properties for each theme and go forth and conquer, right? So that makes theming so much easier than it used to be. And it means I don't have to remember hex codes, because who remembers hex codes?
I love that. Yeah, another thing that I really like is like I mentioned earlier, picking out examples of this, of like, oh, the profile picture or the avatar that is being used in the profile card. Like in the past, I might have done that with like a div and then a background image and all of that. But this is using the image tag, which is accessible, and you can add an alt text attribute to it. And just giving me that idea of how to style it properly and accessibly is really great in a real world example.
Well, that object size is really powerful too, because now you've got being able to adjust the image the same way that background allowed us to have cover for quite some time now. You can do that on the image now, which didn't used to be the case. And that's really what allows that to be possible, because otherwise, if you're trying to make a rectangular picture square, to be able to round your corners and get a legitimate circle and not some kind of oblong monstrosity, you kind of needed that. So that technique of using the background color just as much as a handful of years ago was pretty much kind of how you were going to do that, because we didn't have clip path at the time and we didn't have any of the other, so that's kind of what you had.
Yeah.
I'm curious, I feel like your book goes into depth so much. Did you all learn anything while writing the book, or is this mostly knowledge that you already had?
There's a couple properties for me where it was like, oh, it can do that, or like, oh, there's a value for that. There's always details that you learn writing stuff, because I'll be referencing something to go make sure that I'm correct, or make sure that I'm not saying something dumb, or double checking like the can I use. It's like, oh, this is now fully supported. I didn't realize that. Those sorts of things. For the most part, the core concepts, I think we already both pretty well knew. It's once you get into the weeds, into the details, where you always end up learning something new.
Yeah, 100%. I think we knew what was going on, but it's kind of like working out what's actually the case right now and kind of what's the situation. And it's kind of like working out, which bits do we include, which bits we don't include, and those sort of decisions. But yeah, for the most part, we had the underlying knowledge.
Is there anything that you didn't include that you wish you could have? Maybe because support's just not there yet, or it's not completely finalized, or something like that?
I think container queries for me.
I was 100% going to say the same thing, container queries. But, that kind of took off like halfway through writing this. That's just the situation. But yeah, container queries, 100%. Love to have covered that.
I think user invalid as well for me, just for forms. Because we already have, he can check that input is invalid. But user invalid bridges that gap to somebody having interacted with the property. And so now you can have has user invalid show my error message, which, completely changes the game and means that you can show error messaging using CSS. Well, you still have to handle the accessibility side of it. But in terms of the show height and everything else, you're down to a CSS solution without having to do, and then for animations and stuff, it becomes a lot nicer and things like that. So the user invalid, for being able to not yell at the user the instant they, load the page because the thing is invalid, would be really nice. But I think only one browser supports it at the moment. I'd have to double check.
Yeah, Firefox. I was just looking it up because I have not heard of this, but this is amazing.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many hacks where we reached for JavaScript in the past that CSS is slowly taking over all of this ground, and I appreciate it.
But it feels like so much of a contained way of doing it, right? It's just just use this attribute or whatever it's called, and you're done. You don't have to bring in some library and do it in some specific way.
Oh, just import.
Yeah.
NPM install. It's a solution to everything. No.
Is there any chapter here where you feel or concepts where you feel it would have really saved you a ton of time and effort when you were learning CSS? I'm oh, if only I had been told X 5 years ago.
Forms.
Interesting.
Because of styling radio buttons and styling drop downs and understanding why CSS wouldn't let me do the things I was trying to do, I think would have saved time and frustration a lot.
Martine, I think you definitely committed to that, because chapter 10, all about forms, that's our longest chapter as well, coming in about 41 pages. So yeah, Martine is definitely committed to sharing her findings on forms.
They're complicated. That's all there is to it. They're just hard.
Yeah, for me, I think grid, flexbox, those sort of things, when I learned CSS, they didn't exist. I learned it, obviously as we go along. But I feel now having grid and flexbox kind of in a project format, for me personally, I kind of like that approach of doing something visual and kind of seeing something and how that CSS can affect the layout. I think that's kind of the useful thing. Like, this is why I kind of like this book in particular is kind of like you're focused on the project and you kind of learn the CSS as you go along. So it's just a personal preference of like how I like to learn CSS.
I 100% agree.
There's a goal or a reason, right? Because it's so hard to learn something if you don't know what you're applying it to or what it's for, or what the reason is. Because I can get told I need to know advanced algebra in order to be an architect for a bridge. But if I'm getting taught the math to architect the bridge while building the bridge, it's a lot nicer. Probably not as safe, but a lot nicer. Probably a bad example.
The quick wins are so important, right? Where like when I'm learning something, I don't want to just read a reference manual. I will lose interest within 30 minutes. But if I'm making something and kind of see how those apply, I'm going to be motivated to keep going.
Exactly.
It's really nice.
Yeah. And kind of having practical examples, because maybe I'm looking up something specific, like, oh, I want to use this specific property, but then I see like a real world example and it's like, oh, maybe I'm wrong in my assumption that that's what I actually want. And I can see like, this is a better way to do it, or a more accessible way. Like that's one thing that I always come back to. And so like just being able to compare and kind of pull out pieces from little contained projects like this is so nice.
Actually, that's one thing I wish I had been told early on in my development career is don't bother trying to read the specs cover to cover. Like, go find the piece you need out of the spec when you need it. There's no, like, trying to read specs cover to cover before you start coding the language is a fool's errand. Like, I wish I'd been told that, because the nerd in me went straight for, oh, you're going to learn the WCAG specification. Good, let's go read the spec. And I tried to do that with XSLT, and yeah, no. No.
It's ambitious.
Yeah.
In fairness, I did not make it through. But the hours I spent before I started, like I wish somebody had told me that was not the way to go.
So yeah, some of the other projects in here include like a web newspaper layout, hover interactions. We talked about the profile card. There's a whole section on float, which is awesome. I want to dig into that a bit more. A checkout cart, the big form section, which is also something that I really need to go through, and more. And then you kind of talk about preprocessors as well to end the book. So there's a lot that we can pick up and learn from all of these little projects in here. In terms of the book, it's not officially out yet. Is that right? It's in early access still?
Yeah, so it's early access. There's 10 chapters released right now. We're kind of working on the last 2 chapters whilst kind of going back and refining and taking on board all that feedback. So as was discussed earlier, is that the great thing at the moment is we're kind of getting feedback as we go along and kind of making those adjustments. And then, yeah, so the idea is that I think it's going to go for the big bang sort of publication sometime early next year. So yeah, it's still a lot of activity going on.
You don't need to be special, have anything to be able to get into that early access. It's available through the Manning MEP program. So you just sign up and just know that it'll be, it's the pre-release version. So yeah, there's typos. We're still refining. And I think the pre-sales are up on Amazon, I think now as well.
Yeah.
When you buy the pre-release version in MEP, it does, I think, the ability to go ahead and buy the paper copy for whenever it comes out. I think. Don't quote me on that.
It does. Yeah. I was just looking at it.
Okay. There you go.
I'm a big fan of these because like when I see these books, like sometimes the ideas are so fresh and so exactly what I need right now and I don't want to wait. And so like I love that there's this ability with like the MEP program and things like that to be able to just get at it. And, with the understanding that there might be things that change or things that are kind of broken or not exactly as fine-tuned as you'd want, but you really get the gist if you need. And if you're going to pick and choose like pieces of it too, like it's such a good resource. Any final thoughts about the book, about CSS, about CSS and JS? I don't know.
There's a lot of, so I laugh at the CSS and JS because it all boils, there's religious wars over that and over frameworks and stuff. Yeah. And it's like, do what you need to do to get your project done. But if you have the time and you want the knowledge, learning the core basics of CSS will help you in any of those scenarios and is definitely valuable, regardless of what technique you're going to be using it or applying it within. I think that'd be kind of all opinions about those other religious wars aside, because they exist for a reason, right? They exist to solve a problem. But the end all be all is, if you have the time and want the knowledge, that learning the actual CSS underlying all of that will definitely be helpful regardless of which technique you're using.
Michael, how about you?
I couldn't sum that better up, to be honest. Like I said, CSS is probably definitely, I'm not going to go definitely, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to go away anytime soon.
No.
So I feel like I can be confident in saying, like, yeah, you can pick up this book, you kind of learn one of the 3 underlying principles of a website, HTML, JavaScript, and then CSS. And you should be able to get a little bit more idea of how to start a web page, what's going on. I kind of understand that little bit of magic a little bit better. You kind of know what's going on, rather than being that developer or that person who's kind of like said, oh, can you make this change? And you're kind of trying to hack it together. You can kind of get a bit of a better idea of what is actually going on.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think that really understanding that all of those libraries and, whatever you're using, it's boiling down to this, right? There's always these new features coming out. It's much slower than what we're used to with JavaScript, for example, but there's a lot of features that come out. And I think just keeping abreast of what is out there and what problems are like being kind of slurped into CSS itself to solve, it helps you make better decisions about, well, I don't really need this anymore, right? Like in JavaScript, like that's left pad, right? We don't need that really anymore, but CSS kind of has the same thing, and just kind of understanding how those problems are solved and when you no longer need to externally solve them is a good thing to keep on top of. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have links in our show notes, links to the book, links to some of the topics that we've talked about. Definitely go check it out and enjoy writing CSS. We'll catch you next time.
Our friends at Manning hooked us up with a deep discount for you. Use code PODJSParty20 when you check out to save 40% when you buy Tiny CSS Projects. And guess what? That coupon code works on their entire catalog of amazing books. So go ahead and grab a few others while you're at it. Oh, and they also gave us a coupon code for 100% off one ebook copy. We'll be giving it away in our JS Party community chat in the coming weeks. So hop in the Slack if you haven't yet. It's totally free at jsparty.fm/community. Special thanks once again to our partners Fastly and Fly.io for helping make JS Party possible. To our Beat Freakin' residents, Breakmaster Cylinder, and to you for listening. We appreciate you spending time with us each week. That is all for now. We'll talk to you again real soon.